The church doors didn't open. They exploded. Every head turned. Every breath stopped the man. In the doorway stood 6'4", muscle, bone, and 10 years of mountain survival. He walked straight down the center aisle. No hesitation, no apology. He stopped in front of a woman he had never met. She stood at the altar like facing execution. He kissed her. The most powerful man in town went white with rage. The mountain man reached into his coat. He poured 10 years of savings onto the altar. How much? The air inside was wrong from the start. Not the air of a congregation at prayer. The air of a room where something uncomfortable had been dressed in Sunday clothes. 200 people filled the cedar pews. Farmers, shopkeepers, women fanning themselves against the heat, every face turned forward. Every pair of eyes carefully arranged to look at anything except the altar. Harold Fitzgerald sat in the front row, 53 years old, silver-haired, dressed better than any honest man in the territory, pale fingers steepled. New, smile that never reached his eyes. He had the patience of a man who had already decided the outcome. He was simply waiting for the room to catch up. When he rose to speak, the temperature in the church dropped 2 degrees. Nobody shivered. Nobody admitted they felt it. "We are gathered here today," he said, "in the spirit of Christian charity." His voice was warm, practiced, the voice of a man who had spent decades perfecting the sound of reasonableness. "These dear ladies find themselves in unfortunate circumstances." He gestured toward the altar, through no fault of their own, of course. Unfortunate circumstances. That was his phrase for it. That was what he called, what he had engineered. 3 women stood at the altar in borrowed white. The youngest was Sistine Sarah Morrison, crying without sound. Her father had died 6 months ago. Died broke. Died owing money that had not existed until Fitzgerald's ledger said it did. Her mother gripped her hand so hard the girl's fingers had gone white. The second woman was a widow, hollow-eyed, hands roughened by years of working land that kept trying to kill her. She was not crying. She had moved past that territory long ago. And then, at the end of the altar, Clara Wynne, stood with her shoulders straight and her chin raised, her dark hair pinned up in a style that didn't belong to her, the borrowed dress pulled tight across the shoulders, hung loose at the waist. 3 pins holding up the hem, already working loose. The ivory shoes were a size too small. They had been cutting into her feet since she walked through the church doors. She felt none of it. What she felt was the weight of the room behind her. 200 people. Not one willing to meet her eyes. That was what she would remember most. Not Fitzgerald's voice, not the sound of her own heartbeat. The 200 pairs of eyes that had found somewhere else to be. She fixed her gaze on a point above the back wall. She had learned this as a child. When things grew too large to face directly, you picked a spot in the distance and held on like a rope. Her father had died 4 months ago. Not the way the town talked about it. Not quietly in his bed from natural causes. He had died knowing something. He had died trying to undo something. He had died because someone needed him silent. The debts that appeared in Fitzgerald's ledger afterward, attached to her father's name, bearing dates she could not verify, were the architecture of a trap. She had seen it clearly by the end. Too late to matter. Fitzgerald moved through the room with the ease of a man conducting his own symphony. He gestured toward Sarah Morrison the way a merchant displays a piece of inventory. Miss Sarah Morrison, 16 years of age, an excellent cook, skilled in the domestic arts. The bidding was brief. A rancher named Hewitt stepped forward. 45, thick, deliberate. He looked at Sarah the way a man looks at a horse he is considering purchasing. "I'll take the girl," he said. "Not a question." A transaction. Sarah's sobs came harder. Her mother looked away. Father Mackenzie read through the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man presiding over a burial 5 minutes later. Sarah Morrison became Sarah Hewitt. She walked down the aisle, still crying, while the congregation examined its own hands. The widow went next, faster. A shopkeeper who needed someone to manage his household. At least there was something in his eyes that resembled decency, small mercy. Merciless morning. Then Fitzgerald turned, and the room understood that the main event had arrived. Miss Clara Wynne, he said. He drew it out slowly, tasting it. Daughter of the late Thomas Wynne, educated back east, accomplished in literature, music, and the social graces. He paused, let the silence, stretched away. A patient man lets silence work for him. A rare flower, he said, in need of a husband who can appreciate her qualities. No one spoke. Every person in Cedar Falls understood the game being played. Clara carried debts that could ruin a smaller man. The only figure with money enough to absorb them was the banker himself. This entire morning, the church, the priest, the packed pews, had been arranged to make his claim look like generosity, not collection. Clara kept her eyes on that point above the back wall. She was aware of her hands, trembling very slightly against the folds of the borrowed dress. She was not a woman who trembled easily. The trembling made her angry. The anger helped. Fitzgerald drew breath for his next move, and Clara closed her eyes, one small gesture, private, almost invisible, the last remnant of something finally letting go. The congregation didn't see it, but from beyond the open church doors, from the direction of the main road heading north, came a sound that did not belong to the morning. A horse ridden hard, stopped fast, boots on packed earth. A pause. Then the doors did not open. They were thrown, both at once. The bang of them against the interior walls, landing in the packed church like a stone, dropped into still water. 200 heads turned. He stood in the frame, 6 feet and 4 inches, the size that comes from hard country and harder work. Not the softened size of comfort, buckskin and worn leather, a beard thick and dark, unapologetically wild, trail boots that had covered considerable ground. He smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. He brought the mountain in with him the way weather brings itself, not asking permission, simply arriving. He stood in the doorway for one breath. Then he moved down the center aisle, his boots on the floorboards, slow, deliberate, certain. The pews on either side yielded without anyone deciding to yield. People simply stopped occupying the space in front of him. The way a current moves around whatever enters it. Clara heard him before she turned. She heard the change in the room, the shift. The way ordinary sounds dissolved and were replaced by something more alert. She heard boots coming toward her, and running through the pews, low and urgent, passed from mouth to ear like fire through dry grass. One word, Boone, Silas Boone. That's the beast of Elkhorn Ridge. A woman gripped the arm of the person beside her. A child pressed against his mother's side. An old man in the third pew put his hand flat on the back of the seat in front, as though bracing for impact. Fitzgerald's smile, for the first time all morning, disappeared. Clara turned. He was close. 15 feet. Then 10. Then 5. Up near. He was even more substantial than the doorway had suggested. His face was weathered deeply, the permanent lines of a man who had looked into wind and sun for a decade, without shelter from either. But it was his eyes that stopped her, gray, the color of storm clouds coming in from the north. She had prepared herself for coldness in them, for the flat affect of a killer, an exile, a creature that had abandoned all claim to civilized existence. She had not prepared for warmth. He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the weave of his coat, close enough to catch the mountain air that had come down with him. Cold, pine-edged, honest. He looked at her, not the way Fitzgerald had looked at her, not the way any man in this building had looked at her all morning, like a person regarding another person. "I haven't seen a woman," he said. "In 10 years." His voice was deep, rough from long disuse, but steady. No apology, no performance. Simply the statement of a man who had ridden down from a mountain with one clear purpose and had arrived. The church held its breath. Fitzgerald found his voice. "You cannot simply. This is highly irregular." Silas Boone was not listening to Harold Fitzgerald. He crossed the remaining distance. 3 long strides. His large, scarred hands came up and cupped Clara's face. Gentle, completely, unexpectedly gentle. The way a man holds something he has forgotten how to hold without damage, and he kissed her, not gently, not tentatively, with the full concentrated force of a man who had spent 10 years in a place where nothing touches you. With tenderness his lips were cracked from mountain wind. Beneath her palms on his chest he was trembling, barely, but she felt it. He was frightened. He was doing it anyway. Clara's hands pushed instinctively against him. Her first response, distance, protection. But then the loneliness she could feel through his hands. The careful way he held her face. Like something precious. Like something he was afraid of breaking. One heartbeat. She stopped pushing. She kissed him back. The church came apart. Women gasped. Men shouted. A hymnal hit the floor like a gunshot. Children were pulled against their mothers. Fitzgerald surged to his feet, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of genuine surprise. "This is outrageous. She carries debts." Silas pulled back just far enough to speak. His eyes went to Father Mackenzie, old, shaking, holding his prayer book, with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for permission to do the right thing. "Marry us." Silas said, "Not a request, a statement. She owes money." Fitzgerald snapped, "Significant money, her father's obligations." "How much?" 2 words, flat and clean as a blade. They cut through Fitzgerald's momentum and left him standing in silence, with his mouth half open. "How much does she owe?" Fitzgerald named the figure, $3,000. Half the church drew air. $3,000. More than most men in Cedar Falls would see in 5 years of labor, a number designed to end conversations, to make options disappear, to leave a woman with nowhere to go, except precisely where Fitzgerald intended. Silas reached into his coat. He produced a leather pouch, heavy. The weight of 10 years. He walked to the altar, set the pouch down, opened it, tilted it. Gold coins caught the morning light from the church windows. They spilled across the white altar cloth, across the base of the cross, across the space where prayers were said. In ordinary life, sometimes touched something larger. The sound they made was the sound of a decade. 10 years of trapping and hunting alone. 10 years of carrying pelts down the mountain and provisions back up. 10 years of saving without knowing what for, until this moment. Does that settle it? Fitzgerald stared at the gold. His pale fingers flexed at his sides. Nothing in his carefully prepared morning accounted for this. Father Mackenzie looked at the gold, looked at Clara, looked at Fitzgerald, looked back at Clara. Something shifted in the old priest's face. Something that had been compressed for a long time, finding room, finally, to move. "Do you," he said, voice steadier than his hands, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara looked at Silas Boone, at the storm-gray eyes that had held hers like she was worth holding, at the scarred hands that had touched her face with a carefulness that bore no resemblance to anything she had experienced all morning. Behind her, Fitzgerald's rage radiated like heat from a forge. She knew what refusal would cost her. A sunset wedding to a man who viewed her as a line item. The final acquisition in a very long project. But that was not why she said yes. She said yes because this stranger had walked into a room full of people who feared him without breaking his stride, had set down everything he owned for someone whose name he didn't know, had looked at her, here now, in front of all of it, like a person. "I do," she said, steadier than she felt. "And do you, Mr. Boone?" "I do." No pause. The same flat certainty he had brought to everything else. Father Mackenzie's pen crossed the marriage certificate, the scratch of it, very loud in the waiting air of the packed church. When both names were down, legal, territorial, binding, he looked up. His hands had stopped shaking. "By the power vested in me," he said, "by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Silas folded the certificate, placed it inside his coat. Then he offered Clara his arm, the formal gesture of a man escorting a lady to dinner, oddly precise, oddly correct. And she took it. They walked out together, past the stunned faces, past the women with covered mouths, past the men who had spent the morning looking elsewhere and were now incapable of looking anywhere else, past Harold Fitzgerald, standing in the aisle, fists clenched, watching the carefully assembled architecture of 15 years come apart in the morning light. The doors opened, spring air, real spring air, not the compressed heat of 200 bodies, but Montana in April, pine and cold water and the smell of things beginning. 2 horses at the post, a loaded wagon. Silas helped her mount. Careful, unhurried, Clara settled into the saddle, the borrowed dress, wrong for riding, the ivory shoes still cutting. Everything about her wrong for whatever came next. She did not look back. The trail north rose toward Elkhorn Ridge, dark and enormous against the April sky, toward a life she couldn't picture, a man she didn't know, a future not written by someone else's hand. The church doors swung closed behind them. Ahead, the mountain waited, vast, entirely indifferent to the plans of bankers. Clara Boone did not look back. The trail north out of Cedar Falls was barely wide enough for a single horse. Within a quarter mile, the town was gone, swallowed by the tree line, replaced by hooves on stone and wind, working through pines old enough to have outlasted everything beneath them. The sky narrowed to a moving strip of blue. The air thinned, sharpened, took on the quality of high country air, as though altitude had burned off everything unnecessary and left only what was honest. Clara rode behind Silas on the narrow stretch, beside him where the trail allowed. They did not speak for a long time. Not the silence of people with nothing to say. The silence of 2 people carrying far too much without an established language between them for any of it. She used the time to study him, the way he sat his horse, easy, unhurried, reading the trail ahead with the automatic attention of a man who knew where the loose stones were without needing to think about it. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. A man who had spent 10 years doing everything alone and had stripped every gesture down to its essential function. She had prepared herself for someone harder. The story Cedar Falls told about Silas Boone, the beast, the killer, the man who had retreated to the mountain like an animal returning to its den. Those stories implied a specific kind of presence, coiled, dangerous in the way of things that might strike without warning. Instead, she found someone who moved like deep water. The danger was there. She didn't doubt it. But it wasn't restless. It was settled, patient in a way that she was beginning to understand, more formidable than aggression. "You're not what I expected," she said finally, when the trail widened enough to ride alongside. He glanced over. "What did you expect? Someone more brutal, given what people say?" "What people say is probably accurate," he replied, attention returning to the trail. "I've killed men, Mrs. Boone. The reasons don't rewrite the fact of it. If that frightens you, say so." The formal address landed oddly. Miss Wynne for 24 years. Mrs. Boone felt borrowed, like wearing someone else's coat. She wasn't sure yet whether it would eventually fit or whether she'd spend her life aware of the seams. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked, blunter than intended. The words arrived before she could shape them. Silas pulled his horse to a complete stop. He turned in the saddle and faced her directly, not with irritation, not with impatience, but with the full attention of a man who recognizes that certain questions deserve a real answer. "Never," he said. One word, no qualification, no reassurance layered on top, simply stated, the way a man states a fact he has no interest in debating. Something in her chest, braced for a very long time, eased slightly. They rode on. An hour up the trail, they stopped at a stream, snow melt off the high peaks, running fast over round stones, cold enough to ache. Clara drank from cupped hands and found it tasted of minerals and old ice, clean in a way that had nothing to do with refinement and everything to do with origin. "How long have you been up there?" she asked. 10 years, he said. 3 months, 16 days, a beat, not that I was counting. The first year, he continued, crouching by the water, I thought I was losing my mind. No voices, no conversation, just the work of staying alive, and the sound of things that don't need you. What changed? I stopped, fighting it. He stood, handed her the canteen. The absence of people stopped feeling like punishment, started feeling like the only arrangement that made sense. Until today, Clara said. He considered that, until today. She sat on a smooth stone at the water's edge, her feet grateful for the rest. "Tell me about the Kellermans," she said. "The real version, not what Cedar Falls has been telling itself for 10 years. His jaw tightened slightly. "You certain you want that story?" "I'm going to hear versions of it regardless. I'd rather start with yours." He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decline. Then he began. "The Kellermans wanted our land. 3 generations of my family had worked it. My grandfather broke the first ground. My father built everything standing on it." He kept his eyes on the current. "When my father refused to sell, they turned to pressure, burned the barn, poisoned the cattle, sent men to deliver messages. That weren't really messages. The creek ran beneath his words, indifferent and continuous. They came one night with torches and rope. What happened that night does not travel well through ordinary description. It is a story you have to see. August. The moon full and generous. Silas heard them coming up the road before the torchlight appeared, had known, the way you know, a storm before the clouds arrive, that this night had been building for some time. He had told his father. John Boone had refused to leave 3 generations on this ground. He would not be the one to walk away from it. Silas came out of the darkness at the side of the house. His father stood on the front steps, unarmed, upright, carrying himself the way a man carries himself when the ground beneath him is everything he has built and everything he intends to leave behind. 3 men came through the gate. Jeremiah Kellerman in the center, thick, deliberate, with the expression of a man who had done this sort of thing before and lost no sleep over it. Behind him, 2 others with torches, the barn roof already catching the smell of smoke. Silas stepped into the torchlight. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He stood, solid, without performance, and the fear moving through him like cold water did not change what needed to be done. "Go home," he said, low. "Final. I'll say it once." Kellerman smiled. He looked at the old man on the steps, looked at the young man in the torchlight, looked at the land behind them that he had already decided belonged to him. He took a step forward. Silas had offered them the door. Whatever followed was the consequence of their choosing to refuse it. They did not go home. Back on the trail, 3 men died that night, Silas said, including Kellerman. When morning came, I was standing in what remained of our barn, with the evidence of it on my hands. "You defended your family?" Clara said. "That's what I thought. Still think." He shook his head slowly. "But when the sheriff arrived, I watched their faces. Not fear of a dangerous situation, fear of me, like I'd become something they didn't have a category for. They were wrong, Clara said. Were they? The question was genuine, not seeking comfort, actually uncertain. Defending your father from men who came to steal and burn, that doesn't make you a monster. It makes you a son. Something shifted in his bearing, not dramatically, just a degree or two of tension releasing from somewhere it had been held for a long time. My wife left that same week, he said to me, he said. Mary, she packed while I was burying the dead, took the eastbound stage without a note. Clara offered nothing in response. Some things don't benefit from a reply. The town followed her lead, he continued. Supplies unavailable, work dried up. Inside a month I was a cautionary tale. A pause. So I came up here, and no one came after you. No one wanted to. They remounted. The trail steepened. Cedar Falls completely gone below them, absorbed by distance, reduced to a concept rather than a place. I'm not afraid of you, Clara said. I noticed that in the church. Does it confuse you? Everyone else is. I'm not everyone else. She kept her gaze on the trail ahead, protecting your father from men who came to kill him. That was never in the category of terrible. It was never close. He was quiet for a long stretch. Then, without turning, he reached back and briefly took her hand, one firm, unannounced squeeze, released before she'd fully registered it. Neither of them remarked on it. The trail kept climbing. The cabin appeared through the trees in late afternoon gold. Clara had been bracing herself for something functional and harsh, a trapper's structure. Rough shelter built fast and never finished. What she found stopped the breath in her chest. A real house, not large, not imposing, but built by someone who understood that the things you make with your hands will outlast you, and who had felt the weight of that obligation in every joint and fitted log. Seasoned timber walls, worn to silver gray by years of exposure, a split shingle roof, each piece overlapping the next with the precision of long patience. Glass windows, 4 of them, catching the afternoon light and throwing warm rectangles onto the wide porch boards. 2 chairs on the porch, positioned to watch the peaks go gold at evening. You built this, Clara said. Took most of the first 2 years, the understatement of a man who considers pride a private matter. I wanted it done right. Inside confirmed everything the exterior promised. A stone fireplace built from river rock, mortared coarse by careful coarse, large enough to heat the space through the worst of a Montana winter. Plank floors sanded smooth and polished amber, a table and chairs, handmade, their surfaces worn by use and maintained by care. 1 full wall of shelves, books packed tight, worn spines, varied subjects. The reading life of a man with 10 winters and the patience to fill them. Everywhere, in the fitted joints, in the level shelves, in the precise coursing of the fireplace, stone. The evidence of someone who had taken the time to do it properly. Not because anyone was watching, because it mattered to him that it was done right. The bedroom's through there, Silas said, gesturing toward the back. I'll take the main room until you're comfortable with other arrangements. Practical, direct. He was already moving back outside to unload the wagon. Klaskara stood in the center of the room, breathed it in. The accumulated warmth of years of fires, the smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and the particular scent of a space inhabited with intention. She moved to the bookshelves, ran a finger along the spines, and there, pushed back slightly on the second shelf, behind a row of taller volumes, one that was different from the others, older, thicker. Dark leather handled so many times it had taken on the softness of something living. She pulled it free. No title on the spine. She opened the front cover. The script inside was not Silas's. Smaller, neater, the careful writing of someone who had treated paper as a resource not to be wasted. Brown ink, faded with age, covering the first page in a deliberate hand. At the very top, before any recipe or instruction, A single line for the woman who comes after me, whoever you are. Clara stood very still. From outside, the ordinary sounds of Silas unloading the wagon, wood being set down, horses moved to the lean-to. She turned to page 47. Sordow, never let the starter die. Feed it every day like a child. It will feed you for life. She was still reading when Silas came back inside. He set the firewood downturned, registered her standing with the book open. He looked at the book, then at her face, said nothing. Crossed to the stove, built the fire for supper, his back to her, working with the practiced efficiency of long habit. After a moment, his voice came across the room. Kie. Even, she made the best sourdough I ever ate, he said. Page 47, I know, Clara said. I'm reading it. The fire caught. The first warmth moved out from the stove into the cooling room. Outside, the peaks going amber and pink in the last of the day. Something small and durable took root between them. Not love. Not yet. Something quieter than love, and in its way, more load-bearing. The first real possibility of trust. 2 weeks passed with the rhythm of work and weather. Clara burned the first 3 batches of biscuits, made the coffee so weak it barely colored the water, filled the room with smoke twice by adjusting the stove damper the wrong way. Silas corrected her without condescension, demonstrated. Once answered questions, stepped back, the patience of someone who had taught himself everything by failing at it first. Every morning, after coffee, tin cans on a fallen log. 50 yards out, Clara learned to shoot, not carefully, not tentatively, with the focus and stubbornness her father had called her best quality and her worst, depending on the day. She had decided at that altar it was going to be her best. On the 10th morning, she put 3 cans down without a miss. Silas watched, then he laughed, not a polite acknowledgement, a real laugh, surprised out of him before he could manage it, the laugh of a man who has forgotten the sound of his own amusement and is startled by its return. Clara lowered the rifle. What? He was shaking his head. Something genuinely delighted moving across his face, transforming it. Younger, lighter. 10 years I've been shooting at those cans, he said. Never put 3 down in a row. Clara looked at the cans, looked back at him, and then, despite everything, the strange mountain in the life she was still figuring out, she laughed, too. Genuine, unguarded. She hadn't heard it from herself in months. It was, she thought afterward, the moment the mountain stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like something else, on the 14th day. While Silas checked his trap lines, Clara reorganized the pantry. Her hands needed occupation. Her mind needed something systematic to rest against. She worked methodically. Jars and tins enfolded, cloth, everything assessed and repositioned. She was reaching for a jar on the high-back shelf when her fingers found something that didn't belong, paper folded flat, pushed deliberately, behind the row of jars far enough back that you'd miss it unless you were genuinely looking. She brought it out, yelled at the folds, brittle at the edges. She opened it carefully, the way you open something that has been waiting. The script was not Silas's SB. If you are reading this, the evidence is safe. The cabin will protect it. Trust the mountain man. He is the only one who can help. She read it twice. A third time. SB's Silas Boone. Evidence. She was still holding the note, still turning over those 3 careful sentences, when the afternoon split open. A scream. Animal. Close. The kind of sound that bypasses thought entirely and activates something older. She dropped the note and moved to the window. The bear had come out of the northern tree line, large, lean with winter, hunger, moving across the clearing with a focused intention of something that had identified what it needed. Silas's instructions came back in sequence. Make yourself large. Make noise. Do not run. Whatever you do, do not run. She grabbed the largest pot from the stove, stepped out onto the porch. The bear stopped, lifted its head. Clara raised the pot and brought the wooden spoon down on it as hard as she could. The clang rang across the clearing, sharp and jarring in the mountain afternoon. Hey, get out, go on, go! Her chest was hammering, her grip on the spoon unsteady. Steady. She kept banging anyway, kept shouting anyway. The bear's head dropped. She knew what that meant, without needing anyone to explain it. The lowered head preceded the charge. She backed toward the cabin door. One step, two, eyes fixed on the animal, noise uninterrupted. Her fingers found the handle. The bear moved. Clara threw herself inside, slammed the door, threw the bolt, stood with her back against the wood, while the porch boards shuddered under several hundred pounds of frustrated momentum. The door held. Silas had built it to hold. She crossed the room, grabbed the rifle by the hearth, pressed against the wall beside the window, barrel toward the door, and then, beneath the bear's assault on the railing and the sound of her own breathing, hoof beats, fast. Coming up hard from below, Clara, his voice, from outside, already reading the situation from 50 yards, already acting. 2 shots. Outside, the bear's furious response, not wounded, redirected. More shots. Silas's voice rising. The sound of something large crashing away through underbrush. Then, nothing. A knock, Clara. It's me. The bolt took 2 attempts. The door opened, and there was Silas, whole, unhurt, breathing hard from a fast ride up a steep trail. His expression, not the careful neutral she had come to recognize, open, unguarded, the face of a man who had ridden up a mountain, not knowing what he would find at the top. Are you hurt? No. He pulled her in. Not gentle, not considered, the immediate, reflexive response of someone reacting to the removal of a fear they hadn't fully admitted to carrying. She let herself lean into the solidity of him. Let herself be still inside the fact of his being alive and present. I heard you from half a mile, he said. You told me to make noise. I did. He pulled back far enough to look at her directly. You didn't run. I wanted to. Wanting to and not doing it. That's the whole game. She stepped back, reached into her pocket. I found something, she said. Before the bear, in the pantry. She held out the note. He took it. Read it once. Read it again. His expression closed into something careful and alert. Jacob Morrison, he said. You know him? Of him? Night clerk at Fitzgerald's bank. Died 6 months ago. He looked up. Heart attack. That's what they said. The way he said that's what they said. Flat. Carrying the weight of a man who has learned not to accept official accounts at face value, told her everything. They stood in the open doorway. The bear's tracks pressed deep in the clearing dirt, the mountains enormous and uninterested above them. He hid something here, Clara said. Something he trusted you to use. He never met me. No. She looked at the note again. But he knew enough to trust you. Anyway, there's a difference between those 2 things. Silas folded the note carefully, held it for a moment, his thumb moving across the paper the way you touch something old and important. Then he looked past her into the cabin, at the walls he had fitted, the floor he had laid, the space built over 2 long years in the high country. The cabin will protect it, he said quietly. He meant that as a literal instruction. They looked at each other. We search everything, Clara said. Every board, every wall. They began that evening and worked past dark, methodical, room by room, pressing palms against timber, testing every joint, emptying every shelf. They found nothing before exhaustion stopped them. But as they worked, as the lamp threw moving light across surfaces, and Clara's understanding of the cabin's construction deepened with every foot of wall she covered, something was happening alongside the search itself. Something less tangible and more consequential. 2 people finding the rhythm of working in the same space, learning to anticipate the other's movement, discovering the particular quality of the other's attention when something matters. By the time they stopped, the evidence was still hidden, but they had stopped being strangers. Silas set a tin cup of coffee in front of her. Without being asked, sat across the table. My father and Morrison's father were friends, when they were young, before the Kellermans, before everything fell apart. Clara looked up from the note. How do you know that? I don't. Not yet. He wrapped both hands around his cup, but I think whatever Morrison hid in this wall is going to tell us. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines, that deep, continuous sound like distant water running over stone. Somewhere below in the darkness, Cedar Falls existed, with its bank, its records, its banker, who had watched a careful morning dissolve in a stranger's kiss, and a leather pouch of gold coins, who was not. Clara understood with the certainty of someone who has spent months in proximity to real predators, the kind of man who absorbed a loss and moved on. He'll come after us, she said. Yes. He'll make it look like law. Yes. Which is why whatever Morrison left here needs to be found before that happens. 3 days later, they found the board, back wall of the pantry, the wood slightly different in color, the grain running counter to everything around it, recently replaced, installed by someone who understood that the best hiding place is one that looks like it belongs. Silas worked it free with careful, steady pressure. It came loose cleanly, designed to be removed. Behind it, a hollow space, and in the space, a leather satchel, its buckles gone green with time, heavy. Clara lifted it out, undid the buckles with steady hands, looked inside. Papers, ledgers, documents bearing official seals. Everything organized with the exacting care of a man who had spent his life keeping records, and had understood, at some point, that the most important records he would ever keep were the ones no one could find. On top, a single envelope, addressed in that same careful script, to Silas Boone. She handed it to him, watched his face as he read. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table, did not speak for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes held something she had not seen in them before. Cold fury, not hot, not loud. The kind compressed into something dense and final, the way coal becomes something harder over long time and pressure. And underneath it, recognition, the specific expression of a man who has just understood what he has been trying to understand for 10 years. What does it say? Clara asked. Sela placed his palm flat on the letter. It says Harold Fitzgerald has been stealing from Cedar Falls for 15 years, he paused. And it says he paid the Kellermans to come to my land. The room held that for a moment. 3 weeks before they came with their torches, Fitzgerald made a loan to Jeremiah Kellerman, $5,000. Purpose, land acquisition. He looked at her. My land. When my father refused to sell, Fitzgerald paid someone else to take it by force. The night I defended my family, that was Fitzgerald's plan, being executed. Clara was already reading through the rest of the satchel. Her fingers found something near the bottom, a letter in heavier, more confident script. The writing of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. She saw the date. Her hands went still. This letter, she said, is dated the night before my father died. She turned it so Silas could see the signature, Harold Fitzgerald. The paper was stained in one corner, dried to the color of old rust. Clara looked at that stain for a long time. She thought about her father across the dinner table in those final weeks, the expression of a man carrying something he hadn't yet decided how to put down, the letters she hadn't read, the meetings she hadn't asked about. She understood it now, all of it, the shape of what he had known. The cost of knowing it, he found out, she said. My father found out about Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald couldn't let him speak. She set the letter down carefully, the way you set down something that has just become evidence of the worst thing you suspected. Morrison, too, she said. That's why Morrison died. She looked at Silas across the table. We have to take this down. A judge. The territorial court. Someone with the authority to act on it. That means Cedar Falls, Silas said. His ground, his bank, his influence over every official. In 3 counties, I know. It could get us killed. Clara looked at the satchel, at 20 years of careful secret work by a man who had not lived to deliver it, at a letter stained with her father's blood. Living on our knees gets us killed too, she said, just slower. Silas studied her across the table. The fire had burned low. Outside, the mountain wind had picked up. That building sound, like something scattering itself from a long way off. He reached across and took her hand. All right, he said. We go down, simple, final. The decision of a man who does not make them lightly and does not revisit them once made. But they would not go yet, because the following morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern peaks, hoofbeats came hard up the trail, and the rider who broke through the tree line, looking back over her shoulder, her horse blown from being pushed too fast, up too steep a grade, was a girl of 17 who had been crying at an altar 3 weeks ago. Sarah Morrison had come to the mountain, and what she carried in her coat pocket would change everything. They thought they already understood. Sarah Morrison rode like someone who had made a decision and was not giving herself time to unmake it. She pulled up hard in the clearing, her horse blowing heavily, foam at the bit. She was checking the tree line behind her before she'd fully stopped. The automatic habit of someone who had been watching their back for days and had not yet decided it was safe to stop. Silas was on the porch with his rifle before she cleared the trees. Clara was at the window. Pistol in hand. Don't shoot, Sarah said. Her voice held steadier than her hands. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because trouble is coming your way, and you deserve warning before it arrives, dismounts, Silas said. Slow. She came down carefully. Younger than Clara remembered from the church, or perhaps the church had aged everyone in it, and this was what 17 actually looked like, slight, her father's careful eyes. The set to her jaw that belongs to people who have been frightened for a sustained period and have chosen at some point to stop showing it. Fitzgerald has been telling everyone, you took her by force, she said. Her eyes moved to the window where Clara stood, that the marriage was coerced, that she's being held here against her will. A breath. He's offering $500 for her return, posted in every town within 100 miles. 3 days ago, Clara came out onto the porch. Sarah looked at her, at the worn boots, the practical clothing, the rifle carried with the ease of someone who had been carrying it for weeks. She had ridden up here, expecting to find a captive. She had found something else entirely. $500, Silas said. Bounty hunters will already be moving. Sarah reached into her coat. But that's not the only reason I came. She produced a small envelope. Sealed, on the front, in handwriting Clara recognized immediately, the same cramped, deliberate script from the pantry note. 2 letters. S.B. My father gave me this the week before he died, Sarah said. Told me if anything happened to him, I was to find the mountain man and put it directly in his hands. Before I spoke a word to anyone else, Silas took it, broke the seal. Inside, a small iron key, a strip of paper, an address in Billings, a bank name, and 3 words beneath in Jacob Morrison's hand. Your father's Silas read it twice. He went the particular kind of still that deep water goes, not empty, but holding a great deal beneath the surface without disturbing it. A deposit box, Clara said. In Billings, he turned the key over in his palm. Opened under my father's name. Sarah nodded. My father told me once that John Boone was the most honest man he'd ever known. They were friends before everything fell apart, before the Kellermans, before the exile. She paused. He said they both understood, eventually, that Fitzgerald would come for their families. Sooner or later, they just couldn't know when. So they prepared, Clara said. My father spent 20 years building what's in that cabin wall, Sarah said. And yours, she looked at Silas, spent 20 years making sure there was a safe place to keep the rest of it. The mountain stood enormous and unhurried above them. A hawk turned slow circles on a thermal far overhead, watching the proceedings with professional disinterest. They left their children away to finish what they couldn't, Clara said quietly. Nobody answered that. It didn't need an answer. They rode to Billings before dawn, 2 days later, moving fast wide of the main road, skirting the routes where hired men with descriptions and incentives would be most likely to wait. The bank was where the note said. The box was where the address indicated. The key turned without resistance. Inside, more documents, but different in character from what was in the satchel. These were originals, primary sources, the kind of material that makes a lawyer's hands steady, and a guilty man's go cold. The Geological Survey sat on top. Commissioned privately in 1878, executed by an engineer brought in from San Francisco at considerable expense. Its findings recorded in careful technical language, but communicating its central fact with unmistakable clarity. Beneath the Boone family land, beneath 3 generations of worked ground, ran an underground spring of significant volume, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks, consistent through drought years when surface water failed across the eastern valley. Clara read the notation Morrison had penciled in the margin. He doesn't want the land. He wants the thirst. She set the page down. This was never about money, she said. Control the only water source that doesn't fail in a hard summer, and every farm, every family, every town between here and the territory line comes to you, not once. Every year, forever. Silas said nothing. He was holding a second document, older than everything else in the box, its edges softened by time, a property assessment, Cedar Falls Territory, 1876. The name John Boone appeared twice, beside it, in a different and familiar hand. A brief annotation, acquisition priority. Spring source confirmed. Approach when ready. Clara did the arithmetic involuntarily. Silas had been 10 years old in 1876, his father alive, the homestead whole. The Kellermans not yet arrived, and already, in 1876, when none of it had happened yet, his family's name was on a list. He was planning this before I was old enough to understand what was being planned, Silas said. His voice was level in the way that a very controlled thing is level, not naturally, but through the sustained application of will. Every piece of it connects, Clara said. Your exile, my father, Morrison, the auction at the church. She held up the survey. One spring, under your family's ground. That's what all of it was for. Silas looked at the assessment with my father's name on it for a long moment. Then he placed it carefully back in the box. Then we finish it, he said. They rode back toward Cedar Falls in the last light of afternoon, the originals distributed between them, documents sewn into Clara's coat lining, copies in Silas's saddlebag, a third set left in the Billings bank under a false name with instructions for posthumous release. 3 copies, 3 separate locations. The preparation of people who understood. They were walking into a situation where things could go wrong in multiple directions simultaneously. Tell me about Harrison, Clara said, as the mountains began to drop away behind them. Federal Circuit Judge. Morrison's letter names him. Specifically, says he's been pulling at Fitzgerald's accounts for 3 months, but can't build a case without primary sources. Silas kept his attention on the trail. He's in Cedar Falls now. Comes through twice a year. Is he honest? A pause. Morrison trusted him enough to name him. That's the best answer I've got. The valley opened ahead of them as the sun touched the horizon. Cedar Falls appeared in the distance, ordinary from up here, just scattered lamplight and wood smoke against the darkening plain. No visible evidence of the thing living at its center. "He knows we're coming, eventually," Clara said. "He's been waiting." "Yes." "He'll have the hotel covered, the roads in, anyone Harrison might trust." "Yes." Silas glanced at her. "Second thoughts?" Clara considered the question honestly. She thought about the Geological Survey, the 1876 assessment, the letter stained in one corner with her father's blood. She thought about a clock, stopped, at 3:10 in a dead man's parlor. She thought about Sarah Morrison riding hard up a mountain alone, because her father had asked her to finish what he started. "No," she said. "No second thoughts. It could go badly. Most worthwhile things can." He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize, something between assessment and something warmer he hadn't yet decided what to call. "All right," he said. "We go in after dark, back routes, the Morrison house first, get our bearings, watch the hotel, choose our moment, and if Harrison turns out to be Fitzgerald's man, then we go to the newspaper in Billings, read it aloud in the town square if we have to, a beat, whatever it takes, to make the truth public and impossible to bury." Clara nodded. "Then let's not waste the dark." They circled wide, around the main road and entered Cedar Falls from the north, moving through back lots and the alley behind the tannery, keeping to the unlighted margins of a town going about its evening business without knowing what was moving through it. The Morrison house sat at the edge of town, like a held-breath dark. Windows, garden gone to weed. The particular stillness of a place waiting for something unresolved to be settled, before ordinary life can resume inside it. They tied the horses behind the structure, went in through the kitchen door. Dust, sheet-covered furniture, a clock on the mantel stopped at 3:10. Nobody left to wind it. Clara moved through the dark rooms without a lamp. She had learned in 2 weeks on the mountain that darkness was information rather than obstacle, that the absence of light did not mean the absence of detail. She stood in Jacob Morrison's parlor and thought about the man who had inhabited it, who had come home from that bank every night for 20 years, with Fitzgerald's secrets accumulating in his chest, who had written things down in the small hours, carefully, incrementally in a hand, so small. It required effort to read, because he had understood something essential. Truth does not preserve itself. It requires someone willing to tend it, to carry it forward through time and danger until it reaches hands that can use it. He had chosen these hands without meeting them, based on the character of the father he had known when both men were young, before the world had shown them everything it was capable of. He deserved better than dying alone in this house. With what he knew, Clara said. Silas stood beside her in the dark. "Yes, both of them did. They do now," he said. "If we walk out of Cedar Falls tomorrow with what we came to do finished, full dark settled over the town, the saloon, 2 streets, over leaked music and lamplight. A dog barked somewhere. Thought better of it." Clara checked the evidence one final time, ran her fingers along the hard edges of documents against her ribs, confirmed the pistol, breathed slowly and deliberately the way Silas had shown her when accuracy mattered more than speed. "Nins. Ready?" he asked. She thought about the church, the borrowed dress, the ivory shoes, 200 people who had found somewhere else to look. She thought about her father buttoning his coat, slowly, carefully, turning off the light, and walking out into the dark to meet a man who had already decided what was going to happen. She thought about what it meant to finish something someone else had started at great cost. "Ready," she said. They went out into Cedar Falls together, moving through the dark streets with the particular confidence of people who have stopped being afraid of what's coming, and started being focused on what needs to be done. The Grand Hotel waited 3 blocks east, its windows lit, its side entrance guarded by a man whose casual posture was doing very little to conceal his professional attention. Back entrance, Silas said quietly. Kitchen door, they moved. The kitchen door gave on the second try. Inside, heat, lamplight, the smell of roasting meat. A cook and 2 young women, managing the evening's pots, turned with startled expressions. Clara stepped into the light. Let them see her clearly. Let them see she was upright, armed, and present entirely of her own choosing. "Third floor," she said. "Room 7, please." The cook, broad 50, flour on his forearms, the eyes of a man who makes quick assessments and generally makes them correctly, looked at her for a long moment, took in Silas behind her, made his decision. "Through there," he said, pointing to a narrow door at the back. "Go quick." They took the stairs fast, from the direction of the hotel's front entrance, boots on floorboards, multiple sets. Moving with purpose, word had traveled. The distance between them and the third floor was shrinking from both ends simultaneously. Room 7. Clara knocked. 3 sharp raps. No hesitation. "Judge Harrison, my name is Clara Boone. I have evidence of murder and 15 years of criminal fraud. I believe you've been looking for it." 4 seconds. 5. The door opened. Harrison was 62, silver-haired, the bearing of a man accustomed to being the final authority in whatever room he occupied. His eyes moved from Clara to Silas to the sounds rising from below, and he read the situation with the speed of someone who had not survived 40 years on the frontier circuit by being slow. "Inside," he said. "Now." Clara put everything on his desk. Harrison read the way a legal mind reads, fast, extractive, moving to the next page without ceremony. His expression held its careful neutrality through the ledgers and the loan documents and the records of foreclosures that had never been legitimate. It shifted when he reached the geological survey. He read it twice, set it down, sat back. "The spring," he said. "Under 3 generations of Boone family land," Clara said. He didn't want the property. He wanted to own the one thing. The entire Eastern Valley cannot survive without. Harrison looked at the survey for another moment. Then he looked at Silas. "I've been pulling at his accounts for 3 months," he said. Nothing would hold. Everything legitimate on the surface. He picked up the last item Clara had placed on the desk, the letter, its corners stained dark. "This is Fitzgerald's hand." "Written the night before my father died," Clara said. "My father went to meet him. He didn't come back." Harrison set the letter down with the deliberate care of a man handling something that has just become the center of a very serious matter. "This is enough," he said quietly. "This is considerably more than enough." The door came off its hinges. 3 men, not marshals, hired wait, men paid to make problems disappear before morning. The first one through met Silas's elbow at full force and went down without contributing anything further. The second raised a pistol. Clara shot him, not fatally. The bullet caught his shoulder and spun him hard into the door frame. Her hands had not moved. She had aimed at what needed stopping and stopped it, the same way she had learned to put 3 tin cans down in a row on a mountain. 50 yards from a cabin built by a man's father. The third man looked at Silas, reconsidered, baked into the hallway, with more speed than he'd arrived with. "Window," Harrison said. He was already moving, pulling the satchel toward him with the hands of a man who understood exactly what he was carrying and what it would cost to lose it. "Fire escape. Both of you. Go." They ran Cedar Falls, the way water runs downhill, finding the fastest route through, following the dark. Silas took a grazing shot somewhere between the hotel alley and the back of the dry goods store. Not deep. Enough to bleed. Clara bound it in a doorway shadow, with a strip torn from her shirt, lining working by feel, her mind already past the immediate problem and mapping the next one. Harrison got out, Silas said. I saw him clear the east side. She finished the knot. He has everything. Then it's in motion. It's in motion. The church was 3 blocks south. The one place in Cedar Falls where Fitzgerald's money had always sat uneasily. They came in through the unlocked side door, the way people have entered churches for centuries when they need sanctuary and aren't sure they deserve it. The bell tower was cold and close, smelling of old rope and nesting birds. From its 4 small windows, the whole town spread below, torches moving through the streets, men calling to each other, the organized urgency of a search that didn't know it was already too late. 'Cause across town, in a lamplit hotel room, a federal judge was reading 20 years of carefully kept records, and in the morning a bell would ring. It rang before sunrise. Not the urgent clanging of emergency, the measured, deliberate toll of official summons, the courthouse bell, calling Cedar Falls to account. Silas heard it first. Harrison, he said. They came down from the tower and walked out into the gray morning without discussion. The whole town had turned out. People filled the space in front of the courthouse the way they fill a space when something genuinely significant is happening. Not the performed attention of an organized event, but the real, craning attention of people who understand that what they are about to witness will be talked about for the rest of their lives. Farmers in worn coats, shopkeepers who had closed early, women with children pressed against their sides, old men who had seen enough of this territory to know when a morning was different from other mornings. They had come because the bell summoned them. They stayed because something in the air told them this was not optional. Clara and Silas came through the back of the gathering, on foot, moving steadily, not hiding. People saw them, made room, said nothing. The expressions on those faces, she would remember them later. Not hostility, not welcome. Something more complicated than either. The expression of people who have been carrying a version of a story for 10 years and have just begun to suspect. The version they were carrying was not the whole thing. Harrison stood on the courthouse steps. 62 years old, silver-haired, the bearing of a man who has been waiting 3 months for this specific morning and intends to use every second of it. He held the satchel at his side. He did not pace. He did not check the crowd for friendly faces. He simply stood, present and prepared, the way a man stands when he knows what he is about to do is correct, and is no longer interested in whether it is convenient. When the last of the stragglers had found their places, when Cedar Falls had assembled itself into the shape of a community about to be asked to look at itself directly, Harrison raised one hand. The murmuring stopped. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," he said. His voice carried clearly across the packed square, flat, unhurried, irresistible. "I have called you here this morning to address a matter of grave consequence to every person standing in this square." A pause, not for effect. For accuracy, what I am about to present is not allegation. It is documentation. 20 years of documentation, kept at great personal cost by a man most of you knew as the night clerk at the Fitzgerald Bank. The name landed in the crowd like a stone dropped into water. Jacob Morrison. People who had passed him in the street for 2 decades, who had nodded at him, maybe handed him a coin at the church collection, maybe never thought about him at all, now stood very still. "Jacob Morrison is dead," Harrison continued. "He died 6 months ago. The official account says heart failure. A beat, the documentation he left behind, suggests a different account entirely." Harrison opened the satchel. He did not produce the documents dramatically. He did not hold them up for the crowd to see. He simply began to readers. First, dates, account numbers, the language of ledgers, dry and precise, and, in its precision, absolutely devastating. 15 years of withdrawals from the Cedar Falls Emergency Fund. Small amounts at first, growing bolder as no one noticed, growing larger as no one checked. The total, when Harrison read it aloud, produced a sound from the crowd that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. Something between the two, the sound of people doing arithmetic and not liking what they arrived at. Then the foreclosures. Harrison named names. The Hendersons, the Pritchard family, old Walt Carver, who had died the winter after losing his land and his livelihood, and, by most accounts, his will to continue, farms taken from families who had not actually been in default, loans called in early based on clauses that did not exist in the original documents, paperwork altered after signing, witnesses who, it turned out, had been paid to witness things they hadn't seen. With each name, a face in the crowd would change. A neighbor would look at a neighbor. A woman would press her hand over her mouth. A man would look down at the ground with the particular expression of someone realizing they had misunderstood something important for a very long time. Then Harrison reached the Kellerman payment. He read it slowly. On the 14th of August, 1881, Harold Fitzgerald authorized a loan of $5,000 to Jeremiah Kellerman, purposes listed, land acquisition. 3 weeks later, the Kellerman family arrived at the Boone homestead with torches, rope, and forged transfer documents bearing the falsified signature of John Boone. Harrison looked up from the page. He looked directly at the crowd. Silas Boone did not murder 3 men, he said. The square went absolutely still. Not the polite stillness of a congregation, the deep stillness of 200 people who have just understood something they cannot take back. He killed 3 men who arrived at his family's home with weapons and forged paperwork, intending to take land they had no legal claim to, funded, directed, and equipped by Harold Fitzgerald. The silence held for a long moment. Then it broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It broke the way ice breaks. In spring, from multiple places at once, quietly, the accumulated pressure of too much weight finally finding release, people began to talk. Low voices at first, then louder, then several at once, and then, from near the front of the crowd, movement. She was small, white-haired, perhaps 70 years old. She had been standing near the front since before Harrison began speaking, standing very straight, the way people stand when they have made a decision and are waiting for the right moment to act on it. She stepped forward now. The crowd parted for her without being asked. She faced Harrison first, then turned slowly, deliberately, to face Silas Boone directly, the mountain man who had been called a beast for 10 years, who had spent a decade in exile for an act of defense that this town had chosen to call murder because calling it anything else would have required courage that nobody had been willing to spend. The old woman looked at him. "I was there," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. In the particular stillness of that square, in the way the crowd had gone quiet around her, it carried to every corner. "I lived on the road, past the Boone property. The night the Kellermans came, I was awake. I heard them on the road. I went to my window." She did not look away from Silas. "I saw what they were carrying. I heard what was said. A pause. Silas told them to go home. 3 times, I counted, 3 times he told them, and 3 times they refused. Her hands, at her sides, were very still. I said nothing for 10 years, because I was afraid." She said the word plainly, without softening it. Afraid of what the consequences would be if I contradicted Harold Fitzgerald. Afraid of what would happen to my family. Afraid of being next. I have been ashamed of that fear every single day since. She looked at Silas a moment longer. Then she said, simply, directly, without ornamentation, "I am sorry. What happened next was not triumphant. It did not feel like victory. It felt like something older and heavier than victory, the slow, uncomfortable, absolutely necessary work of a community reckoning with its own choices. A shopkeeper stepped forward, named the day he had refused to sell supplies to Silas after the Kellerman night. Not because he believed Silas was guilty, but because Fitzgerald had been watching and he hadn't wanted the trouble. A farmer stepped forward, described the petition that had circulated calling for Silas's permanent exile, and admitted he had signed it without reading it carefully because everyone else was signing, and it had seemed easier than asking questions. Two women from the back of the crowd, who had known Thomas Wynne, Clara's father, came forward together. They had known, they said, had suspected, had seen things in Fitzgerald's dealings that hadn't added up, told themselves it wasn't their business, had told themselves somebody else would eventually say something, had waited for somebody else for 4 years. Voice by voice, Cedar Falls began the slow work of saying what it had known and not said. It was not enough to repair what had been broken. It never is, but it was a beginning. And beginnings on the frontier were what you had to work with. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd and watched. She watched a town that had chosen convenience over courage for 15 years begin, haltingly, imperfectly, the way all genuine reckonings begin. To choose differently, she thought about her father, about a man who had been terrible with money and extraordinary with love, who had read to her every evening until she was old enough to read to herself, who had told her that the world was changing, that women would need to be strong and smart, not decorative and quiet, and had meant it in every lesson he ever gave her. He had died trying to do the right thing. He was here now in this square, in every word being spoken by people who were finally too late for him, not too late for everyone else, choosing honesty over safety. She felt Silas beside her, his shoulder against hers, solid, present. She did not look at him. She didn't need to. She knew he was watching the crowd the same way she was watching it, with the complex, unresolvable feeling of someone witnessing justice that is real and incomplete simultaneously. He arrived late. This, too, was characteristic. A man who had spent 15 years controlling every room he entered by controlling the timing of his entrance, who understood that arriving after others meant arriving into attention, already primed and waiting. He came through the back of the gathering, with 4 men flanking him, moving forward through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never had to ask people to move, because people had always moved for him. His clothing was immaculate. His silver hair was combed. His face carried the expression of a man who has been interrupted by something inconvenient, but fully expects to resolve it efficiently and be back to his regular business by afternoon. The crowd parted for him. Old habit, old fear, but something was different this morning. People stepped aside, and then they looked at him, not with the avoidance of the church 3 weeks ago. They looked directly, and what was in their faces was not the careful blankness of people who have decided not to know things. It was something Fitzgerald, for all his experience, for all his patience and calculation and decades of reading rooms, had perhaps never seen directed at him before. Recognition. "This is fabrication," he said. His voice was still controlled, still warm. Still, the instrument of a man who had spent his life making unreasonable things sound entirely reasonable. The work of a criminal and a woman he has manipulated into believing she is acting out of principle when she is acting out of confusion. The woman's name, Harrison said, is Clara Boone. The crowd shifted, looked for her. Clara stepped forward. She did not hurry. She did not prepare her face into any particular expression. She simply walked from the edge of the crowd to the open space in front of the courthouse steps, and she faced Harold Fitzgerald's. For the first time, not the careful avoidance of the church where she had fixed her gaze above the back wall, and refused to let him fill her vision, not the compressed, managed composure of a woman in a borrowed dress being processed through a transaction, fully, directly, with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing that needed to be hidden. She looked at the man who had killed her father, who had engineered the exile of the man standing behind her, who had spent 15 years building an empire on the silence of people who had been too afraid or too comfortable or too tired to speak. "You killed my father," she said. Her voice carried, not because she raised it, because the square had gone completely still, and every person in it was listening with the particular attention reserved for things that will not be said again, not because he owed you money, because he found out what you were, and he decided he was not willing to stay quiet about it. Fitzgerald's jaw tightened. A small, controlled movement, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. Jacob Morrison spent 20 years writing down everything you did because he understood one thing that you never did. She looked at him steadily. Evil only survives in the dark. Bring it into the light, and it has nowhere left to go. She paused. He didn't live to deliver it. My father didn't either. But here we are anyway. Fitzgerald held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his eyes. Not fear, not remorse, not the crumbling of a man whose carefully constructed world is falling apart, but recalculation, even now. Even here, the reflexive, automatic response of a man who had spent 50 years treating every situation as a problem to be managed. His hand moved toward his coat. Carter stepped out of the crowd. He had been there all morning, standing toward the back, watching. His badge was on his chest. His weapon was drawn, held low, not raised, present in the way a resolved decision is present. "Don't," he said. One word. Fitzgerald looked at him. The look of a man who has paid for loyalty and has never fully respected anything he purchased, who looks at people the way he looks at tools and is confused when a tool declines to function as expected. Carter met the look evenly. "I signed the removal order that put Silas Boone off his family's land. 10 years ago," he said. His voice carried no drama, just the flat, sustained weight of a man stating what is true, because he has decided that stating what is true is the only thing left to do. "I told myself I was upholding the law. I believed it, a beat. I was wrong about which law I was serving." He did not look at Silas when he said it. He kept his eyes on Fitzgerald. But the words were for both of them, for all of them, for every person in that square who had signed something or looked away from something or told themselves that someone else would eventually say something. "It's over, Harold," Carter said, quickly. Finally, "Put it down." Fitzgerald's hand, still at his coat, did not move for a long moment. The square waited. 200 people holding their breath without knowing they were holding it. Then, slowly, with the deliberate, controlled movement of a man who will not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him hurry, Fitzgerald's hand came away from his coat. The 2 federal marshals came down the courthouse steps. The sound of the handcuffs was very small as in the large morning, a small, metallic, irrevocable sound. They moved him through the crowd, past the farmers whose land he had taken, past the families he had arranged like entries in a ledger, past the shopkeeper who had finally spoken, past the old woman who had counted to 3 and stayed silent for a decade and today had stopped staying silent. Past all of it. He moved through it with the same controlled bearing he had brought to every room for 50 years. And then he stopped. In front of Clara, he looked at her. And what was in his face? Finally, at the very end of it, was not rage, not calculation, not the practiced warmth or the patient contempt or any of the instruments he had used so effectively for so long. What was in his face was genuine, genuine incomprehension. The expression of a man who has lived his entire life believing that people could be divided into two categories: those with power and those without it, and has just encountered someone who does not fit either category. You were a debtor's daughter, he said. His voice, for the first time, was simply a voice, no warmth engineered into it, no calculation, just the baffled statement of a man who does not understand what went wrong. You were nothing. How did you? Clara looked at him, not with triumph, not with hatred, with the clear, untroubled regard of someone who knows exactly who she is and has stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. I was my father's daughter, she said. I was always exactly that. You just never thought it mattered. They took him away. The square emptied slowly. The way squares empty after something large has happened. People lingering, speaking low, reluctant to return to ordinary life before they had finished absorbing the extraordinary morning. Harrison came down from the courthouse steps. He walked directly to Silas, extended his hand. On behalf of the Montana Territory, he said, I apologize for the injustice done to you and your family. All charges against you are dismissed. Your reputation is restored. Your family's land is yours. Silas shook his hand, did not speak for a long moment, stood with the weight of 10 years settling differently on his shoulders, not lifting completely, because 10 years does not lift completely, but redistributing itself into something more bearable, something with a different shape. Morrison's daughter, he said finally. Sarah, make sure she knows what her father accomplished here. She'll know, Harrison said. The whole territory will know. Silas nodded. Clara watched him, watched the man who had walked down from a mountain with 10 years of savings and a decision, and the particular courage of someone who has nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear, stand in the Cedar Falls Town Square with his name. Returned to him his father's name, his family's name, the name that had been made into something shameful by a town that had needed a convenient story more than it had needed the truth. She thought about John Boone, who had stood on a porch in the moonlight and refused to leave the ground his father had broken. She thought about Thomas Wynne, who had put on his coat and turned off the light and walked out to meet the man who was going to kill him because he had decided that some things were worth dying for. She thought about Jacob Morrison, who had sat alone in a bank for 20 years with a candle and a small pen, and the conviction that truth, carefully tended, would eventually find its way to hands that could use it. 3 men, none of them famous, none of them powerful, none of them alive to see this morning, and yet this morning was entirely theirs. They rode back up the mountain that afternoon, not fleeing, not hurrying, moving the way you move when something long and heavy has been set down, and your body is still adjusting to the new weight of carrying nothing. The trail climbed. The air changed. The valley fell away behind them, and the pines closed in, and the sky went wide and blue and indifferent in the way of high country skies that have no interest in human trouble. Neither of them spoke much on the way up, but it was a different kind of not speaking than the ride they had made 3 weeks ago. Not the careful silence of strangers measuring each other, the easy quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to make it real. The cabin came through the trees in late afternoon. Same silver-gray walls, same glass catching the sun, same 2 chairs on the porch angled toward the peaks. Silas helped her down. His hand stayed at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Home, he said. She had heard that word, used carelessly her whole life, used as a placeholder for wherever you happen to be keeping your belongings. Home, she said, and understood it, for the first time, as something you build rather than something you find. That night while Silas slept, Clara rose and dressed in the dark. She moved through the cabin with the easy confidence of someone who knows a space by touch and habit, who no longer needs light to know where things are. She went to the pantry, stood for a moment at the shelf where her hand had first found the note that started everything. The shelf was ordinary now, jars, tins, folded cloth, but she could still feel it, the particular texture of old paper under her fingertips, the yellowed folds, the cramped, deliberate script SB. If you are reading this, the evidence is safe. She took a single stem from the wildflowers she had gathered on the trail down, purple-petaled, taut, small, the kind that only grows on the high slopes of Elkhorn Ridge. She rode down through the dark alone, tied her horse at the edge of town, walked the rest of the way on foot, moving through streets that were finally genuinely sleeping. No torches, no searching, no hired men with descriptions and $500 incentives, just a town at rest. The Fitzgerald Bank sat sealed and dark, the court paper on the door, the wax seal gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Clara worked the flower stem through the door handle, stepped back, looked at it for a moment. It was not a threat, not a declaration, not a message intended for anyone in particular. It was simpler than all of that. A reminder left in a place where a man had spent 15 years believing he could own everything that mattered, that some things grow without permission, that on the slopes above the spring he had tried to steal, in the thin air above the valley he had tried to hold hostage. Things had been taking root for longer than his plan Hesdet had existed, and would go on doing so long after every trace of him was gone. She walked back to her horse, rode up through the dark. The sky was beginning to pale in the east. By this time she slipped back into the cabin. She sat at the table, listened to Silas breathing in the next room, steady, deep, the sound of a man sleeping without the weight of 10 years of unjust exile pressing down on every hour. The mother's book sat on the table where she'd left it. She opened it without thinking, the way you open something that has become familiar, that has become yours, turned past the recipes and the remedies and the accumulated practical wisdom of a woman who had built a life in difficult country and written down everything worth passing on. Near the back, a page with no recipe, no instruction, no measurement, just a few lines. In that same careful hand, some things cannot be taken, only abandoned. Do not abandon them. The land will remember you, even when you have forgotten it. The spring runs, whether or not anyone watches it run. Clara read it once, closed the book, put her hands flat on the cover, and sat in the growing light while the mountain came back to itself around her. Birds first, tentative, and then full-throated, the sound of the high country waking, the way it woke every morning without needing anything from anyone. She thought about the ring on her finger, Boone silver, forged by firelight in the evenings while she slept. She thought about the locket at her throat, the one that had belonged to a woman who had written a book for a daughter-in-law she would never meet. She thought about the cabin around her, every fitted log, every level shelf, every course of river rock in the great fireplace, built by a man who had needed something to do with his hands whilst he waited for a life worth living. She thought about her father, who had been terrible with money and extraordinary with love, who had told her the world was changing, who had died, trying to prove he had been right about what mattered. She thought about John Boone, who had stood on a porch and refused to leave, about Jacob Morrison, who had sat alone in the dark for 20 years with a candle, and the conviction that what he was writing down would matter to someone someday. They had been right. All of them had been right somewhere above, past the tree line, past the high meadows where the wildflowers pushed through thin soil every spring without asking permission. The spring ran, cold and clean, running the way it had always run, through rock and root and the long patient dark of the earth down into the creeks that fed the valley below, not because anyone owned it, not because anyone had planned it or recorded it in a ledger or paid $5,000 to with a torch and a rope to secure it. See, simply because that is what water does. It finds its way down, through the dark, through the cold, through every obstacle placed in its path. It finds its way down. And it keeps going outside. The peaks caught the first light of the new day, gold on their high faces, pink. Along the ridge line, the mountain stood exactly as it had always stood, enormous, patient, entirely indifferent to the plans of bankers and the fear of towns and the small, desperate courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because there was no one else to do them. Clara Boone sat at the table in the cabin. Her husband had built with his own hands on the land. His father had broken, and his grandfather had first touched with a blade of grass and a decision to stay. She sat with her hands flat on a book written by a woman she had never met, for a woman she had not yet known herself to be. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was warm and still, and outside, in the early light of a Montana morning that had no memory of yesterday and no interest in tomorrow, the birds were singing.